All right, let's continue. So we've talked about what employment is, what unemployment is, how the government typically measures both of those uh, statistics, and also calculated some of those statistics for ourselves. We're going to move a little bit more into the different types of unemployment, just to make sure we have a complete picture of what is included. So the first two types we're going to talk about. First one is frictional, and frictional is are those people who are between jobs. They've selected themselves to leave their current job and try to find another one in many instances. So they're looking for a better fit for them. It could be their skills or their interests. It could be that they're following a loved one from the place they are to a different country, a different city. Um, it could be that they don't get along with their coworkers or their boss, but they're looking for a place where they'll enjoy their job more. They'll have a greater sense of contentment and meaning and satisfaction. It could be that, again, company mismanagement. It could be they have a terrible boss who doesn't know how to run a business, and it's really frustrating to work there. And it can also be that they are a young person, either coming out of high school or out of university, and they're just looking for their first job. They don't have a job yet, but we would also consider those people, those new graduates, also to be frictionally unemployed. So normally, this is a good process. It is the process of maybe right sizing or finding the most appropriate fit for yourself, and it's something that's constantly happening. It's something that will always happen because there will always be some of us who are a little bit dissatisfied with the situation we have and want something better for ourselves, something that feels a little bit more comfortable, or maybe pays a little bit more, or affords us a lifestyle that we would prefer to have. So that's frictional. The second one is structural. Now, structural, there's two ways to think about it. One way to think about it is you have situations where people's skills are no longer necessary. So one example of this is the transition from horse-drawn buggies to automobiles, developed by Henry Ford in the Model T. Um, Once Henry Ford was successful in building the Model T and manufacturing on a grand scale, it became much less necessary to have a whole bunch of jobs that were associated with horses. So the raising of horses, the care of horses, the people who had actually drove the horse buggies, the people who built and repaired the horse buggies, the horse whips, the people who were necessary to clean the streets of horse manure that would collect in the streets. All of those people had the skills for those jobs, but those jobs were no longer necessary because more people were driving cars. So in that case, we had an oversupply of those individuals who had those skills. And what ended up happening is those people eventually moved to other industries, got different jobs that required different skills, just because they had to, because their jobs were no longer required. Similar examples might be the fax machine, which none of you have probably ever seen, but 15 years ago, it was still fairly common. It's still easy to find, and 25 years ago, almost everyone had one. But again, it's a technology that's no longer used. So anything associated with that is also no longer used. This phrase, creative destruction, comes from Joseph Schumpeter. It actually appears at the very end of like a 450-page book. But it does suggest that the economy is always changing. Certain industries are always going to be growing. Other industries are going to be declining or dying. And this is the process of how capitalism kind of renews itself. New ideas, creative ideas tend to replace those that maybe can no longer keep up, or no longer relevant, no longer appropriate, given our resources and capabilities. The other way to think about structural unemployment, as I alluded to earlier, is that it's an oversupply, a surplus of people with skills that maybe aren't as required any longer. And this surplus can be created by a number of reasons, and maybe it's easier to explain with a diagram. But if you think back to supply and demand, if we have a surplus, we typically have a price floor above equilibrium. So that creates a situation where quantity supplied, this dot here, quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded at that price. So when we're talking about a labor market, typically if the wage is higher, the salary is higher, we're going to have a lot of people who are interested in working for that wage. But the number of employers, the number of firms who actually want to pay that wage, not nearly as much. So minimum wage is one way to create the situation, because at a minimum wage, people are guaranteed to be paid at least a certain amount of money, and typically a lot of people would like to work for that minimum wage, but employers won't necessarily want to pay it. Labor unions, which are organizations that negotiate on the behalf of workers. So they try to represent typically all the workers at a firm, and they represent in negotiations with the management for those workers. And usually because they're negotiating for all the workers all at once, they're able to negotiate better deals, so better benefits, higher salaries for those workers in that labor union. It creates a similar situation to minimum wage. Because they're able to negotiate better deals for those workers, more workers want to work at those wages, so we have a greater quantity supply of workers who want to work at those wages than firms that actually want to pay that wage. So it's very similar to minimum wage. Efficiency wages, don't worry so much about this. Efficiency wages are when firms pay more to try to encourage better performance from their employees. So if you've studied business and you studied motivation, this is very kind of a Frederick Taylor type of approach, really behavioral, really if I pay you more, you perform more, which in real life doesn't always work out. So again, government policy is a catch-all. It really refers to minimum wage, but again, all of these create more supply than demand for particular wages and skills. All right, two more. So the first one is called cyclical. Sometimes you'll also hear this pronounced cyclical. Both are okay. I won't make fun of you for either of them. If you search in textbooks or if you look online, it's also called demand deficient. And typically it's called demand deficient because it refers to situations in which there's not enough demand in the economy to support the activities of certain businesses. So if you remember the business cycle, if we're at the peak and we're making our way down to the trough, we're in the contraction or recessionary part of the business cycle. And during this, as people start to spend less, firms typically start to produce less. And if they produce less, they need less workers. If they have less workers, those workers no longer have disposable income, which means people have less money overall to spend, which means there's less demand for firms' goods and services. So this process kind of eats itself, and it reinforces a positive feedback loop, I suppose is a better word. I apologize. And this causes the gradual downturn in the business cycle. This isn't good for people and individuals. They lose their jobs and they may not be able to get new ones. And we're seeing situations like this with COVID right now because a lot of people, if they're staying home, they're not spending money as much, which means there's less demand for certain types of businesses. Those businesses can no longer afford to pay their workers. Those workers are out of work and they no longer have money, which means they're no longer spending money. So governments typically try to offset or try to avoid this. The last type of unemployment is seasonal unemployment, and this is, again, what it sounds like. These occupations typically only exist at certain times of year. So Santas, you really only need around Christmas. Lifeguards, you typically only need when people are going to swimming pools, which is often when the weather is warm. Ride operators at amusement parks. In the United States, amusement parks are open year-round like they are here, but they're extremely busy in the summertime when children don't have school. So they need more workers in the summertime to handle the surge of visitors. Ski instructors you only need during the wintertime, and camp counselors you only really need when there's camp. And traditionally, camp has been held in the summertime when students are out of school. So again, the demand for employment in these areas is very seasonal. It only happens for a certain time of year, and then the rest of the year, these people are typically working in other jobs. All right, if you'd like to play along at home, what I'd like you to do is pause the video right now and then go through and try to identify which type of employment each of these is. If you wait 5 seconds, I will go through and give you the answers. Okay, so the first one, computer programmer is laid off because of a recession. This sounds very cyclical. Downturn in the business cycle, they lose their job. Number 2, literary editor leaves her job in New York to look for a job in San Francisco. It sounds like she's doing it for herself, for her own reasons. Could be that she's following a partner who's living in San Francisco and wants to live there with them. It could be another reason. Maybe she doesn't like her boss, but very, very frictional. Number 3, unemployed college graduate is searching for his first job. Again, just graduated, looking for a first job. Sounds like frictional to me. Number 4, advances in technology make the assembly line worker's job obsolete. So technology is improving. The skills the worker has are no longer as necessary. This sounds very structural. The structure of the economy is changing. Number 5, depends. It could be 2. I mean, I'll give you 1 and 2. The first one, it could be, probably is cyclical. I would say only because slumping sales could be representative of the larger economy, and the cashier gets laid off as a result. The second thing could be frictional. It could be mismanagement of this particular firm. The boss isn't very good. They don't know how to market the business. Therefore, customers aren't coming in. They aren't selling. The cashier doesn't have a job. Number 6, individual refuses to work for minimum wage. That sounds very voluntary, very personal. I would say it's frictional. 7, high school graduate lacks the skills necessary for a particular job. They are, it could be structural in that high schools aren't preparing students adequately. I think that'd probably be the best fit in this case. Workers are laid off when the local factory closes because the product made isn't selling. Again, I think this could be both cyclical or frictional. Cyclical because the overall economy is not doing well, therefore the demand is less than it would normally be, but it could be because poor management. It could also be, some people might say structural. There's an argument there. I'd be willing to hear you out on it. And number 9, glassblower becomes unemployed when a machine does her job faster. Very structural change in technology. Her skill is no longer as necessary, which is terribly unfortunate because I'm sure the glass blown and created is quite beautiful.